Hello everyone. Welcome to my first mini lecture on sexual consent. Today we will be tackling the question of what is sexual consent, and we will be working to define it and explore its use in sexual relationships. As just a quick overview, after we define affirmative sexual consent and consent, we will be looking at the ways people express consent in sexual relationships, and some factors that influence how and when we give consent. Then, in response to questions raised by the creation of affirmative consent policies and laws in places like California and New York, we will look briefly at why sexual consent policies have been enacted on college campuses around the country. Before we get started, I would like to preface this lecture and my other video by noting that the data presented here often comes from research conducted on college students, and the context for this lecture assumes a Western American perspective. However, this does not impact the fact that I believe the definition of sexual consent to be universal, and that it applies equally to all people, regardless of culture or context. To better understand sexual consent, I find it easier to first think of it in terms of just plain consent, which can be applied to anything in your life. Consent, by definition, is an intentionally and voluntarily given permission or agreement. In the case of sex, it is an agreement to engage in a sexual activity or permission given to have that act done to you. One of the defining features of consent is that it has to be in the affirmative, and it must be 100% freely given. This means that any use of coercion, which can include lying, begging, threatening, and the use of physical force, invalidates consent even if someone says yes. Furthermore, people can only give consent when they are 100% informed about what they are consenting to and actually intend to consent. Another fundamental aspect of consent is that it is revocable. At any time, you can change your mind and decide, no, actually, I don't want this. And then and there, your consent to the situation or activity is removed. In other words, even if you initially consented to sexual activity, but then for whatever reason changed your mind, you have the right to revoke your consent. And if someone continues doing whatever it is that you decided no to, that is sexual assault, because consent is no longer present in that specific situation. However, I find the absolute most important aspect of consent, whether that be for sex, medical procedures, borrowing a car, or anything else that requires consent, to be that consent is never just assumed. This is perhaps one of the most fundamental but overlooked elements of consent. If we assume consent is there when it really may not be, we run the risk of seriously violating a person's right to decide what happens to their own property and body, committing a crime, or just even being perceived as a rude, unethical human being. Many of us, when it comes to sexual consent, may have grown up hearing the phrase, no means no. But this is literally in direct conflict with this basic tenet of consent, because no means no assumes that consent is present until someone says otherwise, and that is simply not how consent works. In response to the problems caused by no means no, the term affirmative sexual consent and its related slogan, yes means yes, has been increasingly applied to sexual assault prevention. Affirmative sexual consent argues that only a clear, enthusiastic, positive yes means consent to sex. It basically highlights the idea that consent to sex is always asked for and never assumed to exist until someone says no. It also means that silence and/or a lack of resistance does not signal consent, because not only is the passive person not engaged, there is no positive yes or indication of excitement or desire to engage in sexual activity. Additionally, affirmative sexual consent tells us when consent cannot be given, on top of outlining the very basic tenets of the general definition of consent, which I gave you on the last two slides. One of the things affirmative consent emphasizes is that a person who is impaired or incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, who are asleep or unconscious, or otherwise mentally or physically incapacitated cannot legally give their consent to engage in sexual activity of any kind. This is because in being drunk or unconscious, you are unable to be clearly informed about the nature of what is going on, and in many cases cannot actually physically give consent. This means that if you do engage in sexual activity with someone in any of these states of being, you are committing sexual assault, because there both inherently and legally can be no consent. Finally, affirmative sexual consent tells us that just because we've engaged in a specific sexual activity with someone before, it doesn't mean that we automatically give our consent to that activity in the future. Nor does it mean that just because we gave our consent to one thing, that we give our consent to anything else. Consent has to be asked for each and every time, for every activity. Essentially, think of affirmative sexual consent as a slightly more nuanced form of consent, in that it specifically relates sex to consent and gives us clear standards for when sexual consent can and cannot exist. Now that we have a good, solid understanding of the definition of sexual consent, we can look at how people express consent during sexual activity. Consent is conceptualized as an act, either a single act or a multitude of behaviors that mingle together to demonstrate that someone gives consent. This act or acts then creates an ongoing state of consent, which can end when someone either revokes their consent, which again can happen at any time for any reason, or when the consented to activity ends. There are two main ways to demonstrate consent. The first way is through direct or explicit actions like saying yes or I consent, or something definitive like signing your name on a consent form. You can also demonstrate consent through nonverbal, implicit actions like nodding, smiling, leaning back, or returning a kiss or touch. While nonverbal behaviors are rated as less clear than verbal or explicit consent, during sexual situations, people tend to use a number of explicit and implicit actions to demonstrate consent. And research shows that people are fairly accurate readers of nonverbal behavior. After all, we practice reading nonverbal social cues literally all the time. However, it should be noted that gestures and behaviors can really only be read as indications of consent. Why is that, you might ask? Well, a key thing to remember here is that you can only read behaviors and gestures as consent within culturally specific contexts, meaning that people expressing and reading nonverbal cues of consent have to share a general agreement about which behavior means what. And secondly, for some behavior to mean consent, people have to actually know and recognize that by engaging in that certain behavior or by producing that certain gesture, they are consenting. Finally, research shows that people's expression of consent changes with time and experience in a given sexual relationship. In other words, the more familiar and experienced we are in having sex with a certain person, the more we tend to rely on nonverbal consent cues. This doesn't mean that there is less of a need for making sure that your partner is consenting. It just means that people tend to use previous experience with their partner's consent cues, likes, and habits to form a foundation that may allow them to more heavily rely on potentially less clear nonverbal cues. So now we are once again going to turn to look specifically at affirmative sexual consent and its increasingly common role in the lives of today's students. Over the last few years, there have been several stories about instances of sexual assault on college campuses, and surveys consistently show that sexual assault on college campuses is very prevalent, especially for women and LGBTQ+ students. As such, sexual assault prevention groups have increasingly advocated for sexual consent laws, policies, and education, as just one way to decrease rates of sexual assault on campus. At current, only 4 states have affirmative consent laws, with California being the first to adopt affirmative consent as law in 2014. And while the legality and effectiveness of affirmative consent policies have come into question by opponents of both the law and policy, many universities across America have independently adopted affirmative consent policy as part of their plan to prevent instances of sexual assault on campus. This is because sexual assault has been labeled as a form of sex discrimination, and schools are required by law under Title IX to work to address and prevent instances of sex discrimination on campus. Essentially, then, the goal of these policies is to help reduce instances of sexual assault on college campus. And it does this by giving students a clearly worded definition of consent, labeling what consent looks like and under what conditions consent cannot be given, and then requiring them to use affirmative sexual consent in every sexual activity that they engage in. So in the end, while technically there are no laws in most states mandating that every student use affirmative sexual consent, it is still illegal in every state to sexually harass, assault, or rape someone, which in the converse means that everyone is required to get consent for every sexual activity or encounter, because by definition, if they don't, they are committing sexual assault, which again is illegal. To quickly summarize what we have discussed today, we first covered the definition of consent, which gives us the basic parameters for ethical sexual behavior. The next step then is affirmative sexual consent, which specifically emphasizes the need for a yes and tells us exactly what does not equal consent, such as consent cannot be given if someone is impaired or incapacitated, or the fact that consent to one thing does not necessarily mean consent to anything else. We also covered the fact that there are many ways to both give and get sexual consent, whether that be through the expression of verbal or explicit consent, or the use of a myriad of nonverbal consent cues. Lastly, I think the most important thing to remember is that all people both need to give and get sexual consent. The responsibility for consent doesn't just rest on one person, and every participant needs to get sexual consent every time for every sexual activity. If you're looking for more information, I've included some resources and links in the description box below. And I've posted another video regarding some of the more difficult or less thought about aspects of sexual consent, which I encourage you to check out. Thank you for listening.